Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of our meeting of the Committee on the Impacts on the impacts on shipping and commercial, tribal, and recreational fisheries from the development of renewable energy on the West Coast. With our second day of meeting, I'd like to turn it over to one of the committee co-chairs, Michelle, to introduce our panel of speakers.
Great, thank you. With us this morning, we have our information gathering panel that includes Suzanne Plesia from the Port of Long Beach, Jacqueline Moore from the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, and Jennifer Lim from Moffitt and Nichol. Welcome. Not sure who wants to kick it off with a presentation first. Is that Jennifer? Thank you. My head does come above this, yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right. So, yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Lim. I work for Moffitt and Nichol. And so we've been part of a lot of the state studies and also BOEM studies to assess offshore wind ports and their potential candidates for offshore wind in California. So I just wanted to talk at a high level, kind of how we did that planning process and identifying which ports can serve what purposes. Okay, well, you guys all know this, but so what's needed for offshore wind? So wind resource, right? So California has a lot of that off the coasts. An electrical grid, which there are locations along the coast that we can plug into to supply the power. And then also ports and port terminals, which we'll speak on today. So the construction, operations, and maintenance of offshore wind farms require ports that have sheltered harbor areas, large laydown areas, deep navigable waters, and then also heavy load capacity. And that last heavy load capacity is the part where no existing port terminals on the West Coast currently can do that to support offshore wind. So they require significant investment, development. Many ports are needed, not just one. And then also we wanted to say that when we are looking for which ports to identify, that we aren't displacing or replacing any existing marine terminals. So that was, or marine uses. So that was very important to us. Okay. So when we talk about planning for ports, we want to make sure that we're not just planning for the turbines of today, but also for the turbines that we'll have or potentially see in the future. And so on the screen is an image of a potential 25 megawatt turbine. And so as you can see, they're very tall, over 1,000 feet above water. The blades can be up to 500 feet long. The tower above 600 feet above water. And then those foundations can be upwards to 400 feet, which is almost the size of a baseball field. So as you can imagine, each of these components are very large and very heavy. And so they can no longer be transported by road or rail. So everything has to be through ports and maritime and waterfront. So when we did our state and federal port assessments, we were focusing mainly on 3 types of ports. The first is a staging and integration port, which Suzanne will also talk more when she goes into Pure Wind. So these are the big sites that receive, stage, and store the offshore wind components. So things like the nacelles, the blades, and the tower sections. These will come in from other ports, get laid down onto the terminal, and then at the wharf or quayside, they'll assemble the full turbine there in the port, and then tow them out to the offshore wind areas off of Morro Bay and Humboldt in California. And then the next is the manufacturing or fabrication port sites. So these are the ones that will receive raw materials and then create the larger components like those nacelles, the blades, foundations. And then these ones, for the stage and integration sites, those are like the unicorn port sites that require a lot of space, but then also they can't be behind bridges because once you have the turbine assembled, you can't get past the bridge. So that's kind of a big restriction we have on those staging and integration sites. But for the manufacturing port sites, those are allowed to be behind bridges. So that opens up a lot of different possibilities for these port sites. And then lastly, we were focusing also on operations and maintenance sites or O&M sites. And so these are just smaller sites that can be within harbors. And ideally, these like to be very close to the offshore wind farm areas so that the crew that go from the O&M site to the wind farm don't have such a long commute. And then on the screen is some of the design criteria that we were looking for when we were identifying these different port sites. So as you can see for those staging and integration and manufacturing sites, they require quite a bit of acreage. We say 30 at a minimum, but ideally 80 to 100 acres each to have enough space to do some of these operations. And then the big thing is the wharf loading and uplands loading. So that wharf is 6,000 pounds per square foot. And then just to put that into perspective, that's about 6 times stronger than the current wharf container terminals that we have in the ports today. So that is also why there's a lot of development and upgrades that need to happen for these offshore wind ports. And then as you see on the last right-hand side is the O&M criteria. So 2 to 10 acres, so small area. And then the wharf and uplands loading is typical or something you could find in an existing harbor today. Okay, so when we did our state port assessment, we were mainly looking at 2 things. So existing ports and harbors and seeing what kind of upgrades are needed for those. And then the state was worried that we might not be able to find any ports or harbors available for offshore wind. So they said, okay, let's scour the coast and see what we can do if an alternative port site or a new port would look like in California. And so for the existing ports, we assessed the ones shown on the screen here. So Humboldt up in Northern California, a bunch of the Bay Area ports, Port of Hueneme, Port of Los Angeles, Port of Long Beach, and Port of San Diego. And then you can see kind of here their locations in respect to the different offshore wind areas. So there's the Humboldt one in NorCal and the Morro Bay one in Central California. And there's a lot of harbors. So these were mainly assessed for O&M terminals just because they are smaller. And for that alternative port site or creating a new port, the state wanted us to mainly focus between San Francisco and Long Beach. And this is probably more to focus on how are we going to support the Morro Bay wind energy area, as Humboldt already announced that the Port of Humboldt already announced that they were going to do a staging and integration site to support the Humboldt wind energy area. So when we were looking between San Francisco and Long Beach for this new alternative port site, we wanted to make sure that we screened out a lot of existing uses. So residential areas, marine protected areas, military areas, also national marine sanctuaries. And so once we did that, 77% of the coast went away. So that's all that red area was no longer considered because of existing uses. And then we also looked at the national marine sanctuaries and kind of where they were in respect to potentially having new alternative port sites. And so in our AB or Assembly Bill 525 Port Strategic Plan, we identified these ports as good candidates and moderate candidates for the staging and integration sites. So these are the ones that I said were those unicorn sites that need a lot of acreage, can't be behind a bridge, and then these are the ones that are also assembling the turbines and then towing them to the wind energy area. So the green ones were existing ports, so they'll just need upgrades to do these activities. So that's the Port of Humboldt up in Northern California, and then the Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach were also identified as candidates. You'll notice all the Bay Area ports were screened out because they're behind a bridge. And as part of that alternative port site assessment, we identified 3 potential sites: China Harbor, Port San Luis, and Gato Canyon in around Central California. But in the end, we recommended to the state that they focus on upgrading existing ports, so investing in those rather than creating new ports on the coast in areas that they weren't before, because that would take a lot longer. There's a lot of environmental concerns and a lot more investment needed to create ports in these areas. And then the Port of Humboldt and Port of Long Beach, which Suzanne will speak about, are on their way for these projects to support staging and integration sites. The next was the manufacturing sites. So as you can see, there's a lot more potential candidates here. All those Bay Area ports started to open up and be candidates for manufacturing things like nacelles, towers, blades. And so these are the type of sites that provide significant job creation as you're doing warehouses and traditional industrial work, and also providing economic impact to those areas and the state. It is possible for California to provide a lot of manufacturing sites, but that is also the next step in the state's kind of assessment on ports with the AB3 that's coming up, trying to determine, how many manufacturing sites are really needed for the state to say achieve like 50% in-state assembly and 65% in-state assembly, because it might not be. It would take a long time to actually have 100% supply chain within California for these offshore wind components, and there's already existing markets that have them today. So that's what the state will be looking for, is how many manufacturing sites to kind of incentivize and how to drive that investment and bring it back to California. Oh, and then some of the green areas, they were good candidates if they had potential space and didn't require too much dredging for this type of work. But they would all require wharf upgrades. And then lastly were those O&M sites to bring the crew out to the offshore wind farms. So up in Northern California, there was Port of Humboldt and Crescent City. There's a few different sites in the Bay Area that could do it, just depending. Then that kind of depends on the developer's strategy and operations of how far they want to put their O&M facility to support their projects. And then there's also a number of harbors that we identified near the Morro Bay area to support those. Okay. And so here's some of the results we did for the AB 525. And so to support the state's goal of 25 gigawatts by 2045, the state would need 3 to 5 staging and integration sites. So these are about 80 acres each. And then for the manufacturing sites, right, this is if the state did everything within California, it would require 2 manufacturing blade sites, a tower site, nacelle assembly site, and then many foundation assembly and subcomponent sites. And this is because there's not too many large-scale foundation sites to date, just because floating offshore wind is not as common. And I think they're working on large-scale projects right now, but none have been really done to date. So it's a very new industry. And then for O&M, maybe 9 to 6 berths, which could be like 10 harbor sites. And so that would be if you're having 25 gigawatts, that's almost like 25 projects, right? And so that's a lot of O&M sites that you need to support those projects. And then we also listed some acreage for the mooring line and anchor storage and electrical cable laydown sites. And that is, I think, the end of my presentation. Do I stay up here? Do I sit down?
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Any questions for Jennifer before we move on to our other presentations? Jeremy.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. I was a little surprised at the relatively small size of port that you were suggesting, because to get to 25 gigawatts, it would seem you would really want a very large marshaling port. There are some in Europe that are, say, 200 to 300, 400 acres. And it would also maybe allow you to co-locate some of the manufacturing, which, given the floating quayside assembly, there's certainly some advantages to not making the components up in San Francisco Bay and then taking them by boat down to Long Beach and then assembling them and then taking them up to Humboldt. So what's the strategy there?
Yeah. So we did this assessment before the Port of Long Beach came out with their project. And so we were really worried that we would be able to find within an existing port a large area space. And obviously, if you have more acreage, everything becomes a more efficient operation. And so when we were looking at maybe just a 30 to 100 acre site for just a one staging integration, that was the kind of minimum we needed to maybe do, like, to support a 1 gigawatt project that a developer might have. But obviously, if you have more space, that's creates a more efficient operation. But we were just looking kind of for a minimum for it to help the state kind of figure out what are the potentials and do we have enough potential port sites within the state to reach your goal. So that was kind of the reasoning behind looking at smaller sites versus trying to find a 400 acre site, which would not have been possible until Suzanne started her Pure Wind project. So,
Thank you. And just on you talked about not displacing. I think some of what we've seen on the East Coast is that it's not so much the issue of the deployment and installation, but the O&M. So you're going into smaller marinas, and you're not necessarily going to build new small marinas. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, as far as additional slips. And so in that case, you may be displacing berths for commercial fishing vessels where they come in for processing or the like. So how did you deal with that
yes.
issue?
So we did outreach to all the ports and harbors that we were identifying in this study, and so we talked to the harbors and the ports and asked, okay, what is this site used for? What is that one? And they'd be like, oh, that lease might end in X amount of years. There could be a potential for a developer to come in and use it once the current existing use is done. And so that's kind of how we identified what was a potential candidate versus a not, if it was kind of already having like an existing use or if it was going to, for example, a lot of the ones identified were like harbor wharfs or docks that were not of the best conditions and said, well, if a developer came in and rebuilt it, they could use it. So it was mainly identifying like areas that could be developed in the future. Not necessarily saying, oh, there's a berth being used for commercial fishing now. That's a possibility.
Great, thanks. Mike?
Thanks. I kind of want to pick up on that thread. When you were looking at O&M in particular, how many vessels do you expect for each project and what vessel size would those be?
Yeah. So Typically for each project, we would, after talking to developers, it was possible to do like one SOV. Also, they could do like a crew transfer vessel, depending if they were closer to the site, then they might not need such a larger vessel. But at a minimum, it was one SOV per project. The SOV, I think, is around 200 feet. I want to say something like that. We have the dimensions in our AB 525 port readiness plan. 200
Okay,
around
thanks.
that. Yes.
And then piggyback on that, and you were talking about Morro Bay being, maybe you didn't talk about Morro Bay, but it was definitely highlighted as a potential port that could be available for services at. There's a finite amount of space within those ports, and it's not like you're going to create a new wharf. So when you were looking at potential ports for O&M usage, did you look at the existing uses and, those that are, I don't want to use the word displaceable, but those that are more likely to be displaced by these activities?
So if we're talking about Morro Bay in specific, when we talked to the city, they were saying, oh, there is some potential areas that there could be future development. But ultimately, we weren't quite identifying, specific areas in our study. It said, oh, in the harbor, there could be a potential for one. And then ultimately, it's up to the developer who's going to build out their O&M facility to go look at the site more closely, talk to the community, figure out where they want to have their O&M site, and then also, go through that whole process of, looking through environmental considerations and seeing their operations. So it wasn't necessarily like saying this is a project that could happen here. It said, oh, there's a potential for some developer to kind of go explore in this area and see if they could do a project here.
And then after talking to the city or the Port Authority, whoever has the, governing body for that specific area, did you talk to any of the tenants within those ports?
We did not talk to any of the tenants.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Robert, did you have a question?
Thanks for your presentation. It was really interesting. I had a question about the criteria that you used, because you talked about various things, right? You can't be behind a bridge and you got to have this much acreage. Were those criteria provided to you, or is that something that your team put together a set of criteria and worked from that?
Yeah, there were some criteria already from, say, the East Coast, although those were marshaling ports, which were a little smaller. So what we did was we did a lot of outreach to the developers and to the OEM manufacturers to kind of figure out and piece together, how much acreage would you need, what loading would you need. They always ask for more loading, but as an engineer, we're like,
Yes.
okay. And so based on kind of a lot of outreach and also looking at existing reports done by NREL or other labs, we then kind of pulled that criteria together because we weren't really able to find a published criteria for floating offshore wind projects to support the scale that we needed in California.
Okay, so as part of this project, you developed the set of criteria.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Diana?
I thank you for your presentation. I have a question about, whether your work included any assumptions on ongoing port maintenance. So you identified potential viable locations to start something, but I'm assuming there'll be maybe a changed regime for dredging, sediment management, et cetera, et cetera. And so does your study or your work reflect the need for that level of analysis and making these siting locations?
We did do a very high level touch on it just because we were assessing so many ports. And so we would mainly look at, for example, we were able to get all the bathymetry within the ports and so kind of assess, what is the dredging impact that's needed. And then we also did some very high level costs for some of the improvements. Kind of from afar because we didn't have all the data. And then we also were able to kind of say, okay, well, they need to upgrade their wharf. How much is that going to cost? They're going to demo their existing one, build a new one. They need to dredge to hit this certain criteria. So we did look at what level of improvements were needed, and that kind of did help us kind of do that whole red, green, yellow stoplight assessment.
Thanks. Tracy?
Good morning. I'm Tracy Phillips. Thank you so much for your presentation. My question is similar to Robert's, but about the offshore turbines themselves. So you said those 25 megawatts don't exist. Did you create the criteria for that, or how much input did you have from offshore wind developers?
So we spoke with NREL, and then we also spoke with the OEMs and the developers to try to put that framework together for a 25 megawatt turbine. So we did speak to them of, okay, what do we have today? We have 12 to 15 megawatt turbines. Based on the trends in the future, we could go up to 25, and that could be something like this. So we did talk to the industry to kind of put that framework together, and also with NREL to try to validate, what could be a possibility that we are looking for within the ports.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Steve?
Yes, thank you. I'm Steve Joyner. Does these acreages, are they already existing dry land, or would that require filling in bays or estuaries?
So it would, for some of the ports, it would require filling in. And so based on, yes, so not all of them are existing terminals. So it would require some type of fill in certain areas.
And I'm not familiar with these harbors or bays that much. So have you already done the work as far as what's using those waters now, as far as the juvenile fish, for example?
No, we did a high level assessment for environmental for some of them, but for some of the, like, for example, Bay Area ports that required a lot of fill and were taking up more space, we would do potentially, like, we would do it as like a yellow or something like that. Because if there was a site, for example, like the Port of San Francisco, where there was already land able to be used for manufacturing, then we put that as a green. So we did do some assessments and kind of helped with that if there was fill required.
Okay, thanks. And I saw a question in the chat about nearby airports and potential conflict with airspace. Have you looked at that as well?
From a high level, we did, but then if, for example, if a port was actually going to do a project, that they would need to do a more rigorous like airspace assessment and coordinate with the FAA.
Thanks. Jeremy?
Yeah. Did you consider other ways to do O&M? So helicopter, which they're considering some on the East Coast, and permanent housing at sea as an alternative to using marina space.
For this study, we didn't, because the goal of the study was to identify potential ports and harbors that could be used. And so even though there are a lot of, innovative ways for O&M or for staging and integration, assembling the towers, we kind of looked at, okay, well, what is the worst case scenario for what we would need within the ports and harbors, and identified those. But we did know that helicopters were an option, but we couldn't, tell the state that for sure 100% everything is going to be done by helicopters, and so you don't need any O&M site within a harbor. So even though that's a possibility, we didn't quite consider that as part of these assessments.
Thank you.
Great. We'll take one final question, and then we'll move on to our next speaker. Keith?
Yeah, thank you. In your charts, you showed quite a draft range, and I think that was next to the terminal, 20 to 50 feet. What depth of water is required to tow these out when they're fully integrated?
So when they're within the harbor, at a minimum, I think we're looking at 40, but that could also restrict the size of the terminal. Oh, sorry, the size of the foundation and turbine size. So if you have a larger turbine and larger foundation, you need more draft depth. So it is going to be kind of a case by case basis on like what each port can provide. And then if you have a deeper draft the developer's able to go bigger on their projects. But at a minimum, I would say probably 40 feet would be a minimum for towing the turbine outside of the port. And then once you're out in the open ocean, everything is okay, minus the waves.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
And next up, Suzanne. Welcome, Suzanne.
All right, thank you. I'll wait for my slides here. Oh, very good. All right, good morning. Suzanne Plesia, Senior Director, Chief Harbor Engineer. And just want to say thank you for having me here today to share a little bit about the Port of Long Beach's proposed pier wind project to support offshore wind development in California. All right. All right, Jim, right or left, up or down? Okay, hang on. Okay, well, the laser works. Let me see. Okay, sorry. All right. My apologies. Okay, so start with a little bit of background around the Port of Long Beach, which was founded in 1911 when state tithes were granted in trust by the legislature to the city of Long Beach to develop and manage in furtherance of the public trust doctrine. We're known as the second busiest container port in the nation. Last year, we moved a record amount of cargo, 9.6 million 20-foot equivalent units or TEUs. That's the standard unit of measurement for a 20-foot box, with goods valued at over $300 billion. We are an enterprise department of the city of Long Beach with a governed by a 5-member board that is appointed by the mayor and confirmed by city council. And we're also a landlord port, which means we develop the infrastructure, lease it out to operators. That's what generates the revenue for our operation, as well as reinvestment in our infrastructure. So we are a gateway for trans-Pacific trade, and we have been growing and expanding our port to meet that increasing cargo demand over time, primarily through land reclamation. We've actually created about 1,500 acres of new land to meet that increasing need. We now encompass about 3,200 acres of land, 35 miles of waterfront, and 80 berths. Now, our berths are divided up into piers by letter, with piers A through J on the mainland, piers S and T on Terminal Island, and pier W reserved for our outer harbor area. And that is where we propose to build new 430 acres of land for a new terminal and transportation corridor to support the assembly of floating offshore wind turbines and their associated foundations. This is a rendering of what that terminal might look like during assembly operations once the land is created. And I'm going to go over some of the criteria for this type of operation and why we think the Port of Long Beach is uniquely suited for this. Once the turbines are assembled, they'll be towed out to those wind farms in central and northern California. Now, each of those wind farms would be developed by the leaseholders, so the wind farms are not part of the Port of Long Beach's Pier Wind project. Okay, so now I'll go over those staging and assembly port operations and some of the key requirements. Starting with the floating foundations, which requires a heavy lift wharf to receive sub-assemblies and a large area on land to assemble multiple foundations at the same time so that one foundation is complete about every 1 to 2 weeks. And this is important to meet the production rate for commercial scale wind farms. Once fully assembled, it needs to be transferred from the land into the water. So you need a heavy lift wharf in deep, calm water. What we're showing here is a semi-submersible barge. There are other proposals for this transfer, but this is one that has been used in previously. That semi-submersible barge would then sink down and the foundation would float off. So for that sinking operation, you would need a sinking basin about 80 to 100 feet deep. A foundation would then be pulled over to the quay where large cranes would then integrate those components onto the foundation. So you need a heavy lift wharf to support those crane, large area to stage those components, and a long quay to support component delivery at the same time as integration activities, as well as deep, calm water, which is important because small movements in the floating foundation could translate into large movements at the top, which would be a challenge for integration activities. Once fully assembled, that turbine would then go through pre-commissioning testing. So you need pedestrian access and power for that operation. And the staging and assembly site would need a significant amount of wet storage for fully assembled foundations waiting to be integrated at the quay, and fully assembled turbines waiting to be towed out to the wind farm. Now, this is very important because foundation assembly, integration, and tow-out operations all have different variables and production rates. So the wet storage area provides a buffer between these operations to help facilitate an efficient serial production. Once fully assembled, weather, met-ocean conditions are right, that turbine is then towed out to the wind farm. So the staging and assembly site would need facilities to support the mini vessels for that tow-out operation. And as Jen covered, those turbines have been getting bigger and bigger over time. This past year, there have been pilots in that 20 to 25 megawatt range. So that's what we anticipate will be the scale of turbines for California offshore wind farms, which would be as tall as the Eiffel Tower. And as Jen already said, that staging and assembly site cannot be behind a bridge, which makes it extremely challenging to find suitable sites on the West Coast for that staging and assembly operation. Which is why, in response to that critical need, the Port of Long Beach developed the Pure Wind concept, specifically designed to meet the unique requirements for staging and assembly. Because we believe the Port of Long Beach has unique qualities that can meet that scale of floating offshore wind as part of the largest industrial port complex in the nation. Our outer harbor area is behind a federal breakwater, so it's already deep, calm water where that new facility can be constructed. It's adjacent to one of the state's deepest and widest main channels that's out in front of our bridge, so there's direct access to the open ocean with no bridge restrictions. And being in Southern California, we're adjacent to the state's largest manufacturing base and workforce, which will be helpful when launching a nascent industry here. We also have built-in supply chain and transportation logistic networks and a long history of developing this type of marine infrastructure, particularly land reclamation. So the Pure Wind facility would be the nation's largest purpose-built offshore wind facility, specifically designed to be an efficient floating offshore wind turbine assembly hub. It would have large areas for staging integration activities, co-located with large areas to assemble multiple foundations at the same time, with a continuous heavy lift wharf to support those various operations, and docks to support pre-commissioning activities with pedestrian access and power. Large areas for wet storage of foundations waiting to be integrated at the quay, and another large area for wet storage of those fully assembled turbines waiting to be towed out, and docks to support the vessels for that tow-out operation. And as the green port, it would be designed to be the cleanest and greenest offshore wind terminal operation. All of these features are designed to work together to facilitate that efficient serial production that will reduce risk, reduce cost, and help lower the cost overall for offshore wind energy. When it comes to schedule, we believe time is of the essence. We've put together a very ambitious schedule, and if we're successful in starting construction in 2027, the first 200 acres would be operational with assembly operations in late 2031. The second 200 acres would be operational at the end of 2035. We're currently working on a joint EIR-EIS. The Port of Long Beach is the CEQA lead, the Army Corps is the NEPA lead, and we hope to release that document in fall 2025. Since releasing our concept in May 2023, the port has been very busy developing the design. We've done extensive field investigations, starting with the geotechnical investigation, performing 36 borings. Those borings help inform our rock dike design, pile design, and our fill surcharge and wick design. We've also conducted sediment sampling, collecting 22 sediment samplings around the facility. This helps inform, again, our dredge and fill plan. We've also recently finished doing sediment samplings at an adjacent sand borrow site. We also conducted extensive wave analysis for the complex. We deployed 2 new instruments in our outer harbor. That helped update and validate our wave model. Importantly, we confirmed favorable conditions at the proposed pier wind key for integration activities, and we confirmed no adverse impacts on the existing terminal operations within the complex. So we've updated all that information used to update our fill and dredge plan. This provides us an opportunity. The majority of the fill is going to come from right around the pier wind facility. It provides us an opportunity to create the depth we need for the integration and wet storage activities and beneficially reuse those sediments to create the land for pier wind, as well as the sinking basin. Okay, that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Brian? Lots of questions in the room.
I now know the cue on the questions. Okay.
Yes.
Hey, good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. Really fascinating. I can see you're well down the ways thinking this through and moving into project planning. So great stuff. Just a question for you about your comment on existing port operations. And I wonder if you could maybe expand a little bit on your assumptions around the staging area, towing operations, vis-a-vis safety zones if needed, and the vessel traffic service, any considerations with regard to the navigation of these tows, especially given the anchorage, and we won't talk any more about the anchorage, I promise.
That's okay. Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely an important consideration. When the Port of Long Beach really initiated this, that was absolutely a criteria that we cannot disrupt our existing trade operations. So we've been working very closely with our port pilots and the Marine Exchange, doing the analysis of what that might look like. We will be doing a full bridge simulation as well in the very near future. We've done some preliminary review with our port pilots. They did feel it can be accommodated. There would be a channel closure during those movement operations, but based on the vessel traffic within that part of the channel, they believe that it could be easily accommodated. Does that fully answer your question? I apologize.
Yeah, no, I think that gets to the exact point. I expected the Marine Exchange was already part of that. And what I think I hear you saying is the Marine Exchange believes the timing of these closures can be done such that there would be no adverse impacts to at least Long Beach and I assume the surrounding maritime activities as well.
That's correct.
Great. Thanks. I'm just going to go around the room. Mike?
Thanks. I'm going to kind of piggyback on Brian's question there. With the anchorages that currently exist where this location is planned, those anchorages will go away, I assume?
That's correct. We are looking at potential shared use for that wet storage area and an accommodation for a larger anchorage than what is currently available in that area. Those anchorages are old and small, and so they do need to be redone. I think there is maybe an effort already underway, but we would go through that effort with, again, Marine Exchange, Coast Guard, and the pilots to identify if a shared use is possible, a carve out for a larger anchorage than what is currently available. And we did do an initial analysis of the F&G anchorages within the complex area, and we believe that we can accommodate the displacement within the F&G and D anchorages for those uses.
And then how much space is there between the outside edge of the staging area and the break wall itself? And here I'm thinking, there's a lot of commercial and charter boat and recreational vessels that are tied up in the back there over where Queens Wharf used to be. And they go up to San Pedro to access the bait receiver. I'm just wondering if there's any potential to impact their operations.
Well, part of our criteria was to allow a through fare lane, basically between the wet storage and the breakwater. So that's one thing that we were working with our pilots on, to make sure that there's enough space between where a turbine might be anchored and the breakwater to allow that through movement. Yes. But the number escapes me right now.
And then just for my own knowledge, would these be towed out of the LA side or the Long Beach side?
Only the Long Beach side.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Steve?
Thank you. More fish questions. I've heard concern expressed by folks from the fishing industry in Southern California about filling in part of the harbor there. And so again, the concern is the impact to juvenile fish, particularly. I wonder, have you had any communication with the fishing industry in Southern California?
Me specifically, no. We are doing the analysis, the biological survey and the analysis of that through our draft EIR right now, the technical study for that.
I would recommend, just to help things go smoothly, the Pacific Fishery Management Council is meeting in Roanoke Park in June, and the groundfish folks will be there. I don't think the CPS will, but a lot of the fishing industry folks will be there.
Okay.
And I'd encourage somebody to come and speak about this.
Thank you. I didn't have a chance to write that down, so I'll get that again from you after
Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And then I'm just curious about maintenance. Can these be serviced? 1,000-foot tall structure at sea? Do they have, in the towers, do they have elevators? And would they need to be towed back in for structural repairs? And what about the life? What's the life on these structures in the harsh marine environment?
I'm going to go in reverse order, and then I will, if it's okay to the committee, if Jen Lim has any additional comments from our technical advisor. Lifespan around 25 to 30 years is my understanding. Jen will correct me if I'm wrong. From a maintenance perspective, there is my understanding that certain activities can be done in situ at the wind farm. There is a lot of innovation right now, definitely a push to try and do more and more of those maintenance activities right there at the wind farm. The current or the previous thought, or current thought, I don't know, I'm not the developer, but to disconnect and to tow back to port for major maintenance operations. So maybe replacing a blade, maybe there's something wrong with the nacelle and they need to do some major service activities. Right now, that would be a tow back to port for the major maintenance activities. But like I said, my understanding is there's certainly a lot of interest and innovation around trying to do more of that activity in situ at the wind farm. Jen, did I do okay? I got thumbs up, so okay.
Thank you. Robert?
Thanks. I had questions about the form factor of the foundation that was in your presentation. It all seemed very focused on this 3-column design. Is that the only one that you're envisioning using, or do you envision using other? Because there's no sort of industry standard for what those foundations look like. How did you settle on this one that's in the
Yeah, and that's a very good point. We aren't selecting the foundation, the offshore wind developer is. And so when we embarked on this endeavor, we wanted to make sure that we designed something that allowed flexibility, as the maximum amount of flexibility that we could, so that the foundation designers could continue with innovation without too much restriction around that. That will help certainly from efficiency and cost. So it's kind of similar to how Jen described, the approach there on looking at the ports. We did a lot of industry outreach, a lot of the foundation designers thinking about, okay, what might that envelope look like? Of course, this is all confidential business information for them. So it's a challenging conversation to have. And we just want to say, well, is this enough or do you need more? The primary focus for us is around the steel foundations. I will say that we did look at concrete briefly, but those are challenging from an infrastructure standpoint. And we felt that it would primarily focus in on steel. Again, it's not our choice on what that foundation looks like, but our approach to designing a facility was we had to narrow in on what that technology might be. More recently, our understanding is the center column design. The industry is definitely focusing in on that for those 20 to 25 megawatt. When we embarked, it wasn't clear what that foundation design might look like. So you do see a lot of the 3 column.
Yeah.
In our updated rendering, we tried to express the flexibility. So you'll see a center column design and a 3 column design within that rendering to try and communicate that it could vary depending on what the wind farm, the developer's choice, and we don't know what that configuration might be.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
And then I had a question about the transfer to the barge that then takes it to the wet storage area. Is that a skid transfer, or are you lifting those onto the barge?
So what we're showing there was something that occurred, I think it was in Spain from that particular picture. And my understanding, they were using SPMTs to roll it onto the barge. And this is one of those areas, again, that is challenging when you're trying to design a port facility where you're trying to allow this kind of flexibility.
Sure.
The semi-submersible barge is an expensive operation, and that, there's concerns or challenges around maybe a Jones Act vessel needing to be that, and how big is that vessel? So I think the industry has been moving more towards a non-vessel type barge transfer or other innovative solutions around maybe a lift, strand jacks. There's all kinds of thought processes on how can I get it from the land into the water at the least cost. So we just wanted to make sure when we're designing that we could accommodate something like a semi-submersible barge with a sinking basin if that is the preferred solution.
Sure. So it's very conceptual at this point,
Yes.
and things can change.
Yes.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, Tracy?
Good morning. Thank you so much for the information. That was super helpful. 2 quick questions. Where was the proposed sinking basin? Is that inside the breakwater or outside the breakwater?
It is, and I apologize. I did not point that out. You can kind of see it on that last slide on the bathymetry. You'll see it's inside the breakwater, to answer your question. And if it's north of the Pier Wind facility, kind of closer towards that Navy Mole area, right off of the main channel, you'll see sort of a carve out in a rectangular that is a darker blue color. That is the proposed sinking basin. That's important because it matches very closely with the bathymetry of the main channel in that area. So you don't create a sink, sort of a anoxic area, right? So you've got the flow of the water through the area and you don't have a deep pit, if you will.
Great. Okay, thanks. Second question. You said during the integration from the foundation and adding the piece on top, you need very calm water.
Yes.
How long is that process expected to take? And then would that prohibit deep draft traffic from moving while it was being integrated?
So the integration activities, it's my understanding, conceptually is about 1 week is what the target is. And I think that that's the achievable time on those integration activities. As far as whether wave action from vessel traffic might be disruptive to that, Jen, do you have any thoughts on that? Those are pretty low waves considering that the foundations are designed to handle very large waves in the wind farm. So, Jen?
Yeah, so the whole integration process could take roughly like a week, but the actual picks themselves are a matter of hours. So you just need like a window and they'll time it with make sure the tides are correct and that the, turbine is in the right position, same with the crane. And so we did do an assessment on from the wave results and determining like, what is the wave limits, will they be able to do that operations and they will.
Thank you.
Jeremy?
So I'm going to switch sort of gears and ask you what you've done on as far as sort of local community engagement related to port development and also related to the public trust doctrine and use of public trust waters.
So I'll start with the public engagement. We've done very extensive public engagement to really get the word out to our community. What we found is, there's not a lot of understanding about offshore wind here in California and what it would mean. So it's really been right at the ground level, going to neighborhood associations and community events and presenting to try and get the word out. We've also created a new forum for this project specifically. We call it our Zero Roundtable and Zero Collaborative, where we bring individuals from different sectors. So labor, education, port operations, industry, utility, a broad spectrum to share. There's about a 30-person forum within the roundtable. That's where we talk very detailed, kind of similar to this, about what does this operation look like? What might those impacts be? And, how can we optimize and mitigate? And then we have a collaborative, which is an open public forum. We just had the last collaborative this last week, about close to 100 people. And that's where we talk again about the operations. We invite the community to provide feedback on that. And any, you mentioned a fishing group, right? So we are looking for any forums where we can get the word out and get that feedback. The other question was on,
Public trust doctrine.
Public trust doctrine. So yes, we have an MOU with the State Lands Commission, who has that higher level oversight of the public trust, the State Tidelands Trust. And so we have been communicating with the State Tidelands on the use of state tidelands for this purpose and been very supportive. The port studies for AB 525 were actually commissioned by the State Lands Commission. So we've had very good communication about and support from the State Lands Commission on this proposed use.
And just to follow up on the first part, have you had discussions about any community benefits agreements related to the local community, or have your actions all focused on engagement and trying to educate the public on what was going on and seeking some input, I would hope, too?
It's been primarily the latter, but community benefits are a natural part of the discussion that can come out of those engagements. I should say that the Port of Long Beach has the largest voluntary community grants program of any port in the nation. And so we are regularly engaging our community through the community grants program, asking them, what are your priorities for the types of community grants they would be looking for? And so there's a regular solicitation every year on community grants. So that, as we talk about maybe a new development for the Port of Long Beach, that can be part of that larger community grants dialogue with our community, or part of a, more focused engagement on pure wind. But within the proposed CEC grant, there is a much more robust process that we've outlined within that proposed CEC grant that would help engage community-based organizations that would do outreach with our community, and they would help develop a framework around what community benefits might look like should the Pier 1 project be approved. So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Thank you.
Thanks. And we'll have one final question from Dave.
This is not directly related to the port, but as a biologist and an oceanographer, I'm curious about the risk and transport of these enormously tall objects between the port of Long Beach and Eureka or Morro Bay wind farm locations. From a stability perspective, I've spent a lot of time at sea on ships, been rolled around a lot, and I'm just curious: is there a risk of these things toppling over? And I'll say that I know a lot of work has been done in the North Sea and in other places, but those are different areas in the Pacific. I'm just curious. It has to do with the location of the Port of Long Beach as a staging area and a building area and all this business. Have those considerations been, I'm sure they have been made. What's your comment?
We certainly have considered stability of those floating objects as a very important thing. And, I'm going to turn to Jen as our technical advisor on this, but, we don't have a concern. We have looked at that from a stability standpoint, particularly in harbor. When it comes to the towing operations, just as you mentioned, the North Sea and the Kincardine wind farm having been towed from Portugal over there. And then this last year, maintenance operations of the High Wind Scotland project being towed from Scotland over to Norway for those maintenance activities, without incident. And, based on the conversations I've had with those vessel operators, that tow is really not a major concern. They wasn't an issue. But again, I'm not the vessel operator or the developer. Jen, do you have anything to add?
And that's also the need for the wet storage is because for the towing operation, there is a, significant wave height that they can only tow during. And so if the conditions for that tow aren't operable or not conducive for the tow, then the turbine would wait within the port at that wet storage location or wet storage area. And then once the weather or the marine conditions are more suitable, then they'll do their towing activity. And then we will be doing like a full mission bridge for within the harbor to kind of validate the towing operations with the tugs within the harbor and then getting out of the Queen's Gate.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Next up, we have Jacqueline.
Good. Okay. Perfect. Good morning, all. My name is Jacqueline Moore from the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, here to talk about commercial shipping as well as general navigation. So let's see if I can get this to work. Perfect. All right, so what is PMSA? We are a not-for-profit trade association representing both the vessel carriers and the marine terminals that operate on the West Coast. And we do represent both the land and water side, so a bit unique there. And I'm very appreciative for including industry, including shipping in this discussion and overall study. It took a few good years really to get the attention of BOEM and the state to somewhat of a lesser degree because AB 525 did not list, unfortunately, commercial shipping. So it took a bit to get us included in those analyses and even labeled as an impacted ocean user. So again, very appreciative and pleased to be on this all-female panel. There we go. Okay, and to be clear, the industry is not opposed to offshore wind development. Whenever I speak on offshore wind, I really want to drive this home. We are not engaging to be a hindrance at all. In fact, many of our carrier members have a vested financial interest in seeing this offshore wind come to fruition. Our folks are entering the offshore support vessel space. The picture there is Maersk Offshore Wind, who is one of the largest carriers in the world, also a member. It will also be us who will import the turbines, import the components, save for any punitive tariffs, but that's another conversation. And it's also our stevedores, our labor that will load and unload the equipment. So we very much want to see it be successful, but we really simply want to make sure these developments are done in a way that ensures navigation will continue to be safe, continue to be efficient, and of course, observing longstanding rights of navigation. So I always want to start off on a positive note and share that we absolutely do want to be a part of the solution. And I'm going to tell a little bit of a story with the presentation. So this is what our vessel traffic and navigation routes look like today. And you can see very clearly the east to west route to Asia and back, as well as the north and southern route along the coast there. So starting from the north, Strait of Juan de Fuca, up to Canada and Washington State, down to Columbia River in Oregon, then down San Francisco, LA Long Beach, and some of the other ports. And of course, we have the smaller areas like Grays Harbor, Wainimi, and so forth. So it is absolutely quite busy out there. And you'll see these are averaged across a few years. COVID is included in that, but we do have a few more vessels today than what you're seeing up there. All right, then don't have to tell you all this, but part of the presentation around 2020, BOEM really kicked off those efforts to establish wind farms offshore here in California, and then the same for Oregon in 2023 with 4 projects total. So generally, they're about 20 to 35, 40 nautical miles offshore. Coos Bay is a bit farther out, and then guess what? They are directly in our path. Now, this is not a real photograph, obviously, and quite thankfully, this is AI, but this is what we would be up against. And I like to show this, that it would be like ping pong out there. No one wants that. So why do we care? In the maritime industry, safety is always, always paramount to us. Anything new you introduce to the ocean space is a new risk. There could be elisions or collisions. We don't want a turbine. We don't want to hit a turbine, and they certainly do not want to hit us, even though the turbines are a bit bigger at 1,000 feet, 200,000 tons coming at you. You do not want that. And you also have, oh, all my animations didn't come across. That's too bad. Okay, well, and we also have additional vessels in the water. On the right, unfortunately, it's covered. A support vessel hit a cargo ship and all the crew were hurt. Obviously, the crew on the smaller boat were hurt. On the left, there's another news article where the cargo ship actually hit the turbine. And then damaging the hull can lead to oil spills. And as an example, a 2021 oil spill, I believe it was September, October, it was fall sometime, was identified in Huntington Beach and was alleged to have been caused by a vessel anchor that, due to very strong winds, unfortunately crossed over and ruptured a pipeline. Well, that anchorage spot was federally designated years and years before the oil platform or pipeline ever existed. And in 1979, so long before I ever joined PMSA, we cautioned that it was the complete worst possible place to put a platform. It introduced risk. We didn't want the worst possible case to happen, and it did. And so that's what we are trying to mitigate here. And then also interference with ship radar that this very academy has actually studied. And there's other risk from also the mitigation measures that we'll talk about, and also development at the ports, the terminals, and wet storage themselves. All right, and so that overall is why we care. And you remember those maps before with the traffic density and the wind farms? Well, when you put them together, this is what we get: wind farms that are smack dab in the middle of our traffic lanes. It would be like placing turbines on the freeway, very dangerous. If you're on the 405 driving here this morning, you know what I'm talking about. And so on the left, we have cargo, in the middle, tug and tow, and then tanker traffic on the right. I do want to point out I only represent the cargo ships, the one on the left, but because the other folks are here, I always like to throw them in too, because they are also out in the water as well. All right, and here we are for more the Northern California area, not in the most direct path, but still certainly a great amount of navigation out there. And here we are for Oregon. Big ships generally are a bit farther offshore because most of them are headed straight up to Washington. Oregon just doesn't have as much trade comparatively. And so again, the cargo on the left, tug and tow, and then tanker on the right. And then as the farms have not been proposed for Washington yet, I don't have an overlay map, but here is a close-up of our traffic. You have Port of Seattle and Tacoma here on the left, and then Canada above that. And so there is a considerable amount of traffic there because you're basically getting a double whammy going up to the other country. And then you have Grays Harbor on the right, which is in the middle of the state. And you can kind of see here the traffic separation schemes in the inland area there, which essentially just organizes the traffic in opposing directions. So that's what we see up there currently. And then, oh, excuse me, the title's wrong on this one. Sorry about that. But in response to all this interest in offshore wind in 2020, 2021, the U.S. Coast Guard had initiated the first West Coast Port Access Route study called PACPARS. I believe the U.S. Coast Guard spoke yesterday, and I've noticed some folks are here as well. So don't want to be too repetitive, but it's an in-depth scientific analysis on routing and then proposed fairways to mitigate some of those risks that we spoke of. And we worked very hard with our coastie colleagues on this. We wanted to keep the routing efficient and straight as possible. And it is imperfect. It is. Look how we actually buffer the Morro Bay project right there. We're perfectly aligned with the frame there. And then, of course, there's still heightened risk than without the wind farms. But we're very proud of the amount of effort and collaboration that went into putting this together. This is not a small feat by any means. And so this is what the future of navigation will look like on the entire West Coast. You have inner and outer fairways. You have new or revised traffic separation schemes. So this is the future of navigation, and it is busy. And this does not include aquaculture or oil platforms and everything else that is situated in the ocean. But it doesn't stop there. The state has identified future areas of interest. And where are those? They are directly in the path of the new fairways created to help mitigate the already proposed wind energy areas. So the effort is not complete. We will have to all of course, continue to evolve. And I just want us all to work together to make sure the ocean space is as safe as possible as we are all going forward in our renewable and sustainable energy goals. I believe that's it. Yes, perfect. All right, and with that, thank you very much, and happy to take any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you, Jacqueline. Do you have any questions? Ryan.
Hey, good morning. So just to dig in a little bit on PACPARS, from your presentation, I got the sense that you're generally supportive of the proposed offshore fairways, inner and outer, and all that sort of thing. I wonder if you have any remaining concerns with regard to where those fairways are in terms of particularly things like loss of power or other stuff like that, and what sort of mitigation measures you think would be effective. And particularly, I was thinking about this. I was wondering essentially what your stance is towards the separation from the edge of the fairway to the wind farm itself.
Good questions. Thank you. And I believe you are one of the Coast Guard representatives. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, we are highly favorable of what was proposed. Again, perfectly imperfect. I don't think you're ever going to perfectly please everyone, but working with Tyson, who oversaw the whole PACPARS effort, was wonderful. He was great to work with, really took what we said to heart, and he did really talk to all sides, to everyone, obviously being a federal agency, very close to BOEM, but navigation is integral to what the Coast Guard does. So overall, we are very favorable. But you are right, in terms of loss of power, that is something we commented on quite a bit, and we proposed a sort of a buffer zone between either the fairway and the wind energy area, or actually within the wind energy area, where if it's, I believe it's 2 miles is the usual kind of Coast Guard buffer zone, is the 2 miles in a recent I guess, release or publishing by the Coast Guard. And so we did propose that. Of course, manufacturers, the leaseholders don't want to hear that they now have less real estate to work with. But that is something we propose, and something that we would like to still see implemented, especially with that map going back where you can see Morro Bay there. It's perfectly aligned with the edge of the NNG area, as well as up to Oregon. It's pretty close. And they did in the final proposed fairway, you can see here, you can see the Coos Bay wind energy area there, that very top red bit. This is from the draft PACPARS, I believe. That was actually cut off there. So they reduced the size to mitigate some of those concerns we have. But very well said in terms of the loss of power. That is something we are concerned about. Of course, these fairways, these are voluntary. These are recommended. Maybe I should have also said that. We do not have to route this way. We will, because it's safe and it's efficient. But we can certainly always go outside of these boundaries. But again, I think we'll have to continue to evolve, a lot more communication. That's something we've also commented quite a bit. Let's all work together on this. We're all out there in the ocean together. So still some concerns, especially with the proposed future areas of interest directly in the path of those fairways. There's only so far offshore we can push us to where, we're out there in the exclusive economic zone practically. So we'll have to continue working together on that.
Great. Just to make sure I'm getting this in my head right. I think what you said was you were relatively comfortable with the sort of the Coast Guard standard 2 mile buffer. But there was no independent analysis that you guys didn't do any sort of modeling or anything else you just were sort of relying on the Coast Guard's usual practice there. Is that right?
Yes, we did. We worked quite closely with Tyson. I mean, we can do modeling. It's certainly not the end of this process. Of course, you have all people know this is not even formalized yet. It hasn't, of course, gone international yet. I think someone needs to do this modeling. Absolutely.
Thanks. Keith?
Yeah, thank you. If the 2 mile buffer is put into place, do you have any concerns about radar effectiveness? And if you do, any suggested mitigation measures?
Well, this very academy is actually researched the radar interference. I would assume, again, not being an expert in offshore wind and turbine interference, I would assume the buffer would help. Of course, the turbines will still be out there, being able to interfere with the radar. I do not have any recommended practices or other suggestions, but I am, or rather, we are all relying on the experts here in this room, the academics, to look into that. Obviously, we will be engaged. But it was very comforting actually to see that surprise study come out from this academy. So it was always a concern, but it's great to see that there are already studies underway.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. My question is about the risk of derelict vessels. In the Salish Sea, there's emergency response towing vessels that are available for the considerable ship traffic that goes between Vancouver and the exit from the Straits of Juan de Fuca, as well as offshore of Vancouver Island and offshore of Nia Bay. There's an ERTV there. In essence, a wind farm is creating a structure that's similar to an island or something like that in an inland sea. And I'm curious if consideration has been given to what happens if a ship were to lose power and navigation and propulsion.
Yeah, so that has actually happened, not here in the US, but there have been stories. In some of the other forums, I have a longer presentation and I have a slide talking about where it has actually happened because loss of propulsion, exactly what happened because I believe it was rough seas, something like that. And there are studies, or maybe not studies, but research underway into what else can be deployed out in the sea. There's certain type of nets or buoys that have been looked at that can be deployed. Again, nothing's foolproof, but there are people looking into what can be deployed to try to kind of buffer any vessels coming toward the turbines. But again, we're 200,000 tons, so.
So in the case of the Salish Sea, I believe that there's basically a tax that's imposed upon the industry to support the vessels that are stationed there at Nia Bay, the tug. Is it conceivable? I mean, it's not the right wording, but that one could do something similar to that for vessel traffic that goes near the wind farms? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud, and maybe that it shouldn't be posed as a question. Maybe it's just to illustrate my thought process, but it would seem to me that strong consideration should be given to the loss of, propulsion and the drifting of ships into these areas. Yeah, okay, I'll stop
No,
there.
I
It doesn't
absolutely-
require a response from
No,
you.
I absolutely can appreciate that. I think our response would be anytime we talk about a new tax or a new fee, a little bit alarming, especially in today's environment. But that's certainly something we can all discuss. I think another comment would be, well, who would that have to be enacted upon? The vessels that are navigating there, bringing the components, been there long before the wind farms, or the manufacturers and the leaseholders that created that new risk. So that's also kind of a consideration we'll have to explore. But I appreciate the question. It's very fair. Yes.
I appreciate the question, Dave, and Steve can attest to this too. I think it took us about 15 years to get the rescue tug to Nia Bay moved from Port Angeles. So appreciate the forward thinking on that. Jeremy?
Yeah, hi, good morning. So help me think this through. So, on land, we don't have our commercial trucks take the shortest routes or the most convenient routes. We route them around cities, we route them around people, we route them around various infrastructure. We build our roads around these. And shouldn't we think about our oceans the same way? Our oceans are a commons, just like we don't want to site floating offshore wind projects where we've got tribal cultural resources or where we've got strong fisheries. We want to be smart in our placement. Given that the added costs are relatively small to taking a slightly longer route, help me understand why marine transportation, why we shouldn't have more flexibility in our routing.
And that's a very fair statement. So we are routing around. I said before, we want to be efficient and straight as possible. It is not as easy as we would be in our cars driving here to go around a hazard in the freeway, for example. It's not as easy as just turning a steering wheel out of the way, so to say. So yeah, we are routing around, but there are other considerations you want to talk about when longer routing. Yes, it may not look as much farther, but there are also considerations like that's more air emissions. So even if we're going, 10 more nautical miles out, you have to think of the additional fuel that's used. That's additional air emissions. That's also something that is heavily regulated in this state, in this country, and the world, especially by the IMO. There's also marine mammal impacts that we have to consider. I do think with this routing, it's actually beneficial to the whales because generally they'll be closer to shore, depending on species, of course. But that's also something that hasn't been modeled, that I've talked to the marine sanctuaries and some other forums that I'm engaged in, that we should look at that. But if we want to route around, say we're going closer onshore, to route around the wind farms, I think that would actually create more risk for the marine mammals. So there's some other considerations that we certainly want to take a look at.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of maybe routing further offshore, not closer to shore, so that you wouldn't, obviously the tug and barge are going to be very close inshore, but the container ships, seems that they could move further ashore. And I agree with you. Whenever we're thinking about, say, air pollution, we need to, and we need to think about this. There are externalities to having you go further. There's no question about that. But there may be, there are also potentially externalities and significant additional cost to building floating further from shore, both from vessel support and loss of energy as you're transmitting into shore. There are a bunch of different considerations. And so have you thought about whether about moving further offshore, not near shore, into where the whales are and where there's other human uses?
Yeah, and we worked with the Coast Guard on this. This outer fairway that's shown, that's at least 10, 15 nautical miles farther offshore than where we route today, even farther offshore in the Oregon area. So we did do that. Again, when we're looking at future areas of interest that are right there in this proposed fairway, that's actually off the continental shelf. So there's only so far they could really put these floating turbines, even though they are so-called floating. So we did go farther offshore, but there's only so many areas that the wind farms can be placed, and that we really want the vessel. So we certainly worked on the Coast Guard with that.
Okay, thank you. And just one quick question. I've always been curious, maybe, that the Law of the Sea Treaty puts a 500-meter buffer from artificial installations. So I'm not quite sure, and maybe you're not the person to answer it, about the disconnect between the 2-mile buffer and the 500-meter buffer that's in the Law of the Sea Treaty.
Different agreements, different purposes, different kind of initiators of why these various suggestions or examples came out. Just the 2 miles is kind of the pretty standard maritime buffer that we would recommend.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. I have Mike, followed by Diana. I think Steve has a legacy.
Oh.
Thanks. I think Keith has a legacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqueline, for being here. Just a real quick question. One of our, well, it's probably not going to be a quick question. So one of our tasks is to review the current decision-making process for offshore wind and to outline recommendations. I know at the outset you expressed concern about how BOEM came in with this, if you were to tell us in your perfect world how the decision-making process for siting of offshore wind could be handled, what would that look like?
Yeah, so I really appreciate that question, Mike. Of course, this is the first time that the U.S. has really undertaken such a task. So, kind of starting from scratch here. One good example I like to point to, and that I read semi-recently, I believe it was 2021-ish, right in the beginning of COVID, NOAA released an aquaculture assessment, and it rated suitability with respects to navigation and other ocean users like military, like fishing, like sensitive habitats, and they modeled it while choosing the suitable areas for aquaculture. So they did it all at one time and they ranked everything. Whereas here, and I'm probably generalizing it a little bit, but they looked at wind speeds and continental shelf and where they could put these floating turbines. And then after the fact, now we're talking about fisheries. Now we're talking about shipping and everything. So I think looking at every input at the same time and doing that modeling is probably the best for all, right? Whereas instead of doing how they did the wind way with how BOEM laid out this process, I think that would be the better scientific approach. I think that could be studied and then expanded upon, not just for this, but for other efforts. So I always like to point to that as an example that can be modeled more. Let's put every input on the table. Let's model it together.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that. And for those of us who were here yesterday, when you heard Kelly talking about the UNCOS spatial suitability model, he's referring to what Jacqueline just mentioned. And they did do that off of Oregon, but they didn't do it holistically. They just looked at the wind energy areas, the draft wind energy areas, applied the UNCOS model to that to winnow that down. So no, very much appreciate that answer. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Diana.
It's like we colluded. That was a great setup for my question. Jacqueline, I really appreciated your presentation, but it stuck with me that you started with the comment that shipping as an ocean user was completely overlooked or not included in the deliberate hard looks that the state of California has done and others. So if you have at hand any suggestions on what would be an effective integration of shipping as an ocean user for potential benefits or maybe negative impacts in this entire approach of not only offshore wind, but also the wave kinetic energy that could potentially be developed. So if you have a few stock talking points on that, that'd be really helpful to just keep in mind as to how the system could be better, because this is still a very nascent process.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I can only talk about, my experience, my situation. I think our issue really came more at the state level because the legislation that initiated the CEC plan, AB 525, it listed a whole slew of ocean users, fishery, military, but we weren't listed. And I will say, maybe to save myself a little bit, that legislation was passed before I joined PMSA. And unfortunately, that just wasn't on anyone's radar at the point. So I think that's really kind of where our initial and greater problem came from. We weren't there at the very first step. And I can kind of appreciate that the consultant was told to do what the legislation said, so they are going to do that. And I can very much appreciate that. In terms of the BOEM experience, that was just having to make those relationships and make those connections of, again, we're not trying to be an impediment. We want to make sure that this is successful, but also we don't want to hit the turbines. We don't want to cause all these other impacts and that I listed there. So while I don't have necessarily the save all of how to make sure everyone has a seat at the table, I think making sure from the very beginning, whomever is initiating an effort has to make the real concentrated, effort to really research everyone that would be a part of it.
So one short follow-up. Would it be reasonable to appreciate or assume that between Coast Guard data and maybe AIS data, that the commercial shipping would be reasonably represented if those data points were thoroughly evaluated throughout like siting and O&M and everything like that?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And one thing we advocated for when PAC-PARS was really kicking off is let PAC-PARS go through its process. Yes, it can take a couple years, but let's do that process and then envelop it into the BOEM analyses, into the CEC analyses. Absolutely. I mean, AIS data, that is paramount of what we have. And, you know, we work very closely with our Coast Guard counterparts. So absolutely, if those data points rather, excuse me, were, you know, part of the inputs on the model, absolutely. Yep. Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time and for your presentations today. They were very informative and very helpful to our study. Thank you.
Just want to, if there's any final questions for the whole panel before we close our session this morning. Just one. Okay, go ahead. And I think David Anning also had a question online too. If David, you want to ask your question after Brian?
Hey, thanks for the comment. I think all of you touched on it at some level, this maritime spatial planning. And I just want to kind of float up a level and ask for your collective input. This is all sort of organized under the executive order on ocean policy. And at least as I understand that process, although it didn't play out this way with regard to the wind energy areas and the port access route study, generally speaking, there's supposed to be a sequence of planning activities, which starts with the port access route study. What that effectively does, though, I think, and what I want to get your input on is it prioritizes the existing shipping routes, because, you know, had this gone that way, the existing shipping routes would have been laid down. We would then not have defined the wind energy areas where they are today. And arguably that would have deprioritized wind offshore renewable energy against navigation, right? And I'm intrigued by the comment Jacqueline made about, like, could we just do all of the zoning up front? Like, take all of these interests. And so I guess for the whole panel, first is, do you have any thoughts about this implicit prioritization of navigation as the first step? So it's the foundation piece under the current policy. Should it be that way, and what would you propose? How do we make that trade-off between other interests and navigation? And then second is, if this was changed, how would you account for, I guess, some sort of rezoning process? Because offshore renewable energy wasn't something we would have considered if we had done a port access route study 3 years ago. And we would have zoned it out because it was where navigation is going. So I just open up to your thoughts on how this sort of maritime spatial planning process might work better from your perspective and experience.
And great comment there. You know, it really is the chicken or the egg. I think it will always be an imperfect process. But in terms of sequencing and prioritizing, I don't necessarily think navigation should be number one in the list of impacted users. Absolutely not. We're all ocean users. Very much respect there. Just in terms of who I actually represent, though, rights of navigation should also be paramount. It's in the Constitution. It's international law. So yes, I do think that should be respected. But I don't want, you know, one of us to be more important, so to say, than the other one. Again, we're all an ocean user. I don't know if I have the winning answer on how to make this a perfect process. And maybe there is no such answer really. But I think having all the information up front, and then we can actually look at a timeline, look at a schedule, again, not wanting to push back offshore wind development, because we don't want that, of course. We have the vested interest, but there has to be a more, say, reasonable way to go about this, so not everyone, so certain parties don't feel like they are being left out, that they don't have a seat at the table. I do think PACPARs could have been initiated a little bit sooner. Again, it was initiated basically because offshore wind development, so I can understand that, and just kind of how federal processes work. So I don't know if I have the perfect answer to that, but having everyone at the table in the forefront, I think, can create a bit smoother process and make sure everyone, is a part of the planning.
And I feel compelled to speak since you said from the entire panel, but I'm not going to be able to offer much better than what Jacqueline just said, having not really been engaged in that activity, being operating in a port. Just from my perspective, though, at the Port of Long Beach, I've been there for close to 29 years, and we never contemplated in our long-term planning this idea of offshore wind. And so when this came up and we understood what the dire need was, we moved quickly to try and see how can we maybe accommodate this without disrupting this very important thing that is our core business of trade, right? That cannot happen. But understanding in that larger picture, for those that don't know, the Port of Long Beach is transitioning to zero emissions as part of this global strategy, really, on decarbonization. We need new energy generation. And so it is, again, in our vested interest as a member of this global community. And, we're going to need this new energy. We need to help facilitate this in a cost-effective way. This is what we could do to help that transition. And a lot of these policies and our thought processes were all laid down before wind energy was even contemplated. And so it forced us to try and think of things differently. And I don't live in that space around the maritime spatial planning part, but it's worthwhile to take sort of that clean sheet of paper look at it and thinking about what this new situation is, this new universe that we live in. How do we now think of things maybe a little bit differently? It's more of a philosophical idea that we had to apply to our own operation at the Port of Long Beach. I don't have some sort of smart answer to you to how that might apply here in maritime law and spatial planning. So, yeah.
He said everyone. I was like, what am I going to say? Yeah, so again, as like Moff and Nick, when we were doing our port assessment, we weren't really, or all those wind energy areas were already identified, and then we came after and we're like, what are the ports doing? And so we didn't really have privy to how BOEM, came up with these different wind energy areas. And also, I'm not going to say whether one takes precedence over the other with shipping, but it makes me kind of curious, what they did on the East Coast, identifying those wind energy areas and how they address shipping. So I guess that's just my thought is, how did they do it on the East Coast with those projects? And is it any different than what's being done currently now in the West Coast planning, and especially for those future areas where there are some areas, but they haven't really been identified yet, or firmed up. So those are just my thoughts on kind of your question.
And perhaps just a quick follow-up comment, I'll take an opportunity to elaborate a little bit more on the aquaculture study that I spoke of, and also talking about the chicken or the egg. While they did use the current navigation routes and actually called those no-go zones for aquaculture, they basically, zoned out everything that was overlapping, which I think is great, but they're looking at the navigation routes now. What about when those fairways are formalized and then we're actually moved offshore, or some vessels are actually moved closer to shore? What if that's now an aquaculture zone that was perfect before? So again, chicken or the egg, it can be a perfect analysis at the moment, but the very next day it can be out of date. So again, perhaps there's no perfect answer. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thanks. Dave Anning?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if this is a question for Suzanne, Jennifer, or maybe for the developers, but I'm interested in the conditions that would be necessary for towing out the assembled platforms, and thinking particularly around the wave climate. Once you get out to point conception, and the limited number of vessels that are available, is there a situation where the wet storage kind of would be full up and you would need to halt production or figure out where else to put the assembled platforms?
Right, I'll go first and then Jen will correct me. Because it is a good question. And, when we're thinking about the design criteria for our facility, and, we honed in on wet storage being important because of what exactly you just pointed out. There are these variables around wave height, weather conditions, mid-ocean conditions, for these windows of the tow out operation. And, could those windows be extended for some other design of the foundation or for a larger vessel spread arrangement for that tow out operation that would increase the tow out windows based on the typical wave climate? And so the wet storage becomes this buffer zone to allow flexibility on those tow out windows. Is there a possibility that the wet storage could fill up, so to speak, to your point, and stop production? And yes, I would say that that is a possibility. And, our approach here is trying to provide as much flexibility in the port facility to allow the offshore wind developers to assemble their, my best analogy is a machine, right? The offshore wind developers are assembling their machine in which they optimize their production to take that into account. And it might be an approach to their vessels choices. It might be an approach to their foundation design. And it might be an approach to how they produce the turbines. They could produce the turbines within set windows that could optimize their weather windows for the tow out operation. Each of those parts of the operation are interconnected. And so, like if I was them, I would optimize my production to avoid a stoppage of production at the assembly on the quay. So it's a complicated analysis. It's not one that, the Port of Long Beach as a landlord port would control. But we want to provide a facility that reduces those risks, allows that flexibility to optimize how a developer could assemble those things and produce things in an efficient production. Does that make sense? Does that answer that? Sorry.
It does. And if I can ask another question, how does the proposed expansion integrate with navigational dredging of both the channel and also the wet storage area itself?
Yeah, so it integrates pretty well, as it turns out. I mean, before we developed Pure Wind, we had already worked with the Army Corps of Engineers to, we don't call it widening of our channel, but to optimize our channel width and depth to help navigation through that deep channel. So there is, we call it the Deep Draft Navigation Project, that will be producing about 7 million cubic yards of sediment. Part of those sediments will be used for a landfill within the harbor, about 2.5 million cubic yards. So that leaves a balance of sediment that needs a place to go. Under that Deep Draft Navigation Project, that sediment would go to deep ocean disposal. So this pier wind provides an opportunity to beneficially reuse those sediments to create pier wind. It also requires deep draft for those large foundations for integration as well as the wet storage area. And so by deepening the area around Pure Wind, it both provides the depth we need for those operations and allows us to beneficially reuse those material to create the land. I think 2/3, and Jen will correct me if I'm wrong, something about 2/3 of that material will come from within the harbor, which will support the depth we need for the integration, accommodate the extended navigation improvements under the deep draft, and then we have an adjacent sandbar site for the balance. So it does fit very well in mutual benefits there.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you again for taking the time and for your presentations and for patiently answering all of our questions this morning. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us and allowing us to share with you our plans. Thank you.
This was also a lot less intimidating than I thought it was going to be. I was like, is this a conference? What is this? How many people are going to be there? And I walked in and I was like, oh, okay, manageable. So thank you.
All right. Again, thank you for everyone that joined us online. And this concludes our open session portion of our meeting. All of the slideshows and recordings of the meeting will be posted to the event website in the coming days and probably next week before recordings get up. But we really appreciate the comments in the chat and questions, and we will work to get any answers back to people that asked questions that we didn't get to. And thank you again. Look forward to following our future meetings through the website that you registered for this event for. And with that, have a wonderful day, everybody.